Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX. I'm Rishabh Gulati. Very happy Diwali to those of you watching us here in India and all across the globe. And what a epic 24 hours it has been. Visuals are coming in of Diwali being marked, diyas being lit, flowers being brought out all across the world. It would be so useful if we utilized this medium of audio-visual television for you today on a news channel. Show you what's been happening right across the globe. That's, of course, in the UK. And then you can really interestingly marvel the scale and the scope of what this can be, or more rather, what this should be. Oftentimes in this country of ours, we are unable to get past the prejudices that have been imposed upon us. The prejudices that were created before we became independent. And the prejudices were, how can you even use Indian festivals to divide us? We embrace all festivals. We have a country in which we have public holidays across the globe, across all sorts of faiths. In a global time when humanity is being tested with aggressive ideology, taking us into a new Cold War, is being tested with a new clash of civilizations that is once again threatening to engulf Europe and North Africa. The message from India tells us quite a different story. I've said it before, and this is an opportunity to say it again. The final answers on how a global community, Vasudev Kutumbakam, a global family, can live in harmony with each other, can only be found from this country. Nowhere else in the world, not in America, not in China, not even in Europe, not in Africa, not in South America. Nowhere else in the globe is there this kind of diversity across 1/6 of the world's population that lives together. We have our problems, but they pale in insignificance. So this gives us an opportunity not only to celebrate but add some perspective. So let us make that attempt at perspective addition. Joining us on the broadcast, Sumit Peer is joining us, Sana Hashmi, Joyita Basu from the Sunday Guardian, Gautam Mukherjee. Welcome all of you and happy Diwali. Appreciate you taking out time from on a holiday for all of this to just add some perspective to our country of what this actually means globally. Sumit Peer, I'm sure you've been watching in the visuals coming in from the UK, New Zealand, UAE, Taiwan, of people celebrating Diwali, just like in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Cambodia, they were marking the Ramayana. What perspective should this give us as Indians?
I think, Rishabh, this is the acceptance and emergence of a global India and the global Indian. Because the stature of India has increased considerably and our diaspora across the world have been our most eminent brand ambassadors. The way they live in a country, the way they contribute to the growth of the country, and the way they spread the message of love, peace and harmony. Because India is a country wherein all the religions live together. The second biggest population of Muslims lives in India. So the way we live, the way we grow and where we grow and celebrate our functions and these together, this is a message to the world. And also it is very important that world starts realizing every sixth person walking on the planet Earth is Indian. And if I add to Jains and Buddhism, which is offshoot of India, every fifth person on planet Earth is an Indian and has a Hindu origin. So it is that, acceptance at the global stage that the oldest civilization on planet Earth is Hindu. They have survived over the times and they are very diligent, peace-loving. They live in harmony. They believe in Vasudeva Kutumbakam. Geo or Jeene Do. That is the motive, Rishabh. That is the message we give.
We've not, I mean, in a country where we have Christmas holidays and have had them all our lives, and I've grown up putting up Christmas trees in my house in a country in which we celebrate Eid and so many Jayantis. What is the perspective lesson here? Because we are still not being able to figure out the end of that conversation, or what is Hindu and what is Indian. How do we take a step forward without just reducing ourselves to what we've seen over the past 70, 80 years into identities? What is the finality of that purpose? Sumit.
Okay, Rishabh, the Hinduism is a way of life. It's not a religion. The first thing we want to get or send it across to the people in the world. You can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, but you can take a thought from the Hindu way of life. You don't have to change your religion necessarily. You know, our tradition comes from 10, 20,000 years of old Gita and all those manuscripts. In our Veds, Upanishads, Purans, Rishabh, there's one thing which is very clear. We talk about Manav. There is not a word which talks about Hindu. So our teachings, our Gyan, our enlightenment is oriented to the whole world and humanity. Look at the good of Hinduism. Look at a religion. Look at a way of life which has survived 20,000 years. Look at a way of life which has handled the slaughter for 1,000 years. Millions of Hindus were killed in that slaughter, but Sanatan survived. It's not because it's a religion. It's much beyond a religion. Why don't you embarrass Hindu way of life?
It's not a. It should be a simpler conversation, but obviously it's not, right? It's not a black and white conversation. I'm trying to have it on this Diwali day. Joyita Basu, here we are. I mean, across the country, we have many festivals that is different. As Diwali is ending, Chhath Puja will be beginning in the eastern part of the country. Durga Puja has just come to an end in Bengal. You have Onam down south, all sorts of celebrations. Yet, we've often gotten consumed in this country in figuring out this difference of what it is to be Indian versus what it is to be somehow Hindu, and the distinction therein defined by religion. How do we take that conversation to a logical conclusion eventually?
Rishabh, first of all, a very happy Diwali to you and everybody else here. And when we are talking about something like this, let's first of all talk about actually there is no quote unquote Hinduism. It's all about Sanatan Dharma. It's about a way of life. I totally agree with Sumit when he's talking about Hinduism being a way of life, because it is Sanatan Dharma. It's about eternity. It is beyond the it's about humanity, it's about people, and it's about how you lead your life in a particular way. But at the same time, it is not even a particular way. There are several ways of leading your life. That is what we have been taught all our life. Now the thing is that if you put it in a context of communities, if India is, and it has been recognized even by people belonging to other religion, that you see, if India is the way it is, if you look at it in a Western context, it is because of the majority religion. If India is so-called secular, secular is different. When you look at Europe, that it's a different. It's different over there in terms of church and separation between church and state. That is not how we look at secularism in this country. We look at it in terms of equality of faith. Now, when we are talking in terms of equality of faith, it may sound boastful, but the fact of the matter is that if India is quote unquote secular, it is because of the way of life of the majority of people who live here. And it is about accommodation.
So Indianness. Yeah, I'm trying to figure this out with just some practical realities. Let me get Sana into this conversation. Sana asked me, eventually, and I'm just drawing a premise out for conversation. If you look at pretty much across the globe, the big countries with large populations are mostly homogeneous. America, for all its democratic credentials, in the end, if you look at the Jewish population, if you look at the Hindu population, if you look at the Muslim population, all of it doesn't add up to more than 10%, 90%. China, 90% of its 1.3 billion people are Han, 90%, right? Minorities are Tibetans, Buddhists, very, very small. The same applies in Europe. Europe, which is the home of, the crusades and the counter jihads that have been going on for 1,000 years. Sadly, in other parts of the colonized world, in South America, where indigenous cultures were completely destroyed, became Christian countries. A lot of that has already happened in Africa. Same applies to Australasia. So in a country that is actually genuinely diverse and has been for pretty much all its history, what is the difference between being Indian and being Hindu?
I think specifically when we talk about Diwali, I don't see it as a religious celebration, because now that I'm in Taiwan, I'm seeing the celebrations in Taiwan, not Diwali. So yesterday I was at this event which was hosted by, organized by Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I didn't see anything religious. I think Diwali is one festival which is celebrated by people from all the religions in India at least. So this is how we are seeing that it's being celebrated by people across the world.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out what is the representation, because the problems in this country of the conversations that we have. I just mentioned that I grown up, and a lot of families have. Christmas used to be a holiday, and Santa Claus is a big thing, and you get gifts and you put up a Christmas tree for some reason, without really looking at it from a religious connotation. But for a large part of our history, we have, at a larger scale, looked at a lot of things simply from a religious connotation. What is civilizational about this, and what is religious? Sana?
You look at Diwali is like you mentioned about Christmas. So I think so is the case with Diwali. So Diwali is associated with crackers. Diwali is associated with light. It's a festival of light. So I really don't see something which is religious or which is civilization when it comes to people from other religions, especially in India.
Okay, we are showing visuals on our screens, Sana, as we speak, of a Diwali celebration being hosted by the Taiwanese president, who is dressed up in a sari, and I can see a dance performance that is going on. At a time like this, where it's a challenging global time, we are in the middle of a Cold War, there are people trying to invoke a clash of civilizations in Europe. Democracy itself is under test. Its constitutions, its voting power has been pitted against different systems of governance that are coming out of China and Turkey and other complicated states. What does that represent specifically, since you know about this topic, about a future relationship between India and other countries like Taiwan?
So I'll talk about Taiwan. So there was the first time that Diwali reception was sponsored by government, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taiwan. So that was a huge deal here. This was actually a response to the warmth and love which Taiwan has got from India first. And second is that so Taiwan is COVID-free. So in order to make Indians feel less homesick, they did such a great gesture. So that is why I said that there was hardly anything which was religious about Diwali yesterday. So Indians from all the religion were there yesterday, and they hosted such a great event for Indians. So I think this is how we have to see Diwali. We have to see Diwali in this light. And Taiwan government throwing a reception for Indian community is very different from Diwali celebration in other countries. Because if you look at diaspora, Indian diaspora in Taiwan, and if you compare Indian diaspora with Indian diaspora in other countries, the number is small. There are just about 5,000 Indian people here. So I think it's very different. So we have to see how Taiwan government is looking towards India, what expectations Taiwan government has for India.
Yeah, and I think we did, but we can do a lot more on the recently concluded Taiwan Day and other things. And that is one particular example. Gautam Mukherjee is with us. Gautam Mukherjee, now here we are, and we are all, both you and me, victims of cultural imperialism. I am a product of Macaulay's Minute, from the medium of instruction of me learning to the suit and tie I'm wearing, although I think this might just be, this is an Italian tie, but nonetheless, it's a reality, right? We are still victims of cultural imperialism. We still face it from the jeans that we wear and the food that we eat. Are we seeing, that change into feeling a bit of pride, where everything Indian was once looked down upon because we simply inherited the same prejudices that were left to us 70, 80 years ago, and that is now changing?
Well, one of the things that is great about India through its history is its ability to assimilate and make one's own whatever comes in through the Khyber Pass or from the seas, and all sorts of cultural influences, people, conquerors, they've all become Indian. The Mughals became Indian. The British who lived in India were a form of Indian. The Anglo-Indians certainly were. Now, lately, one point I think is very important, that India has been a responsible global citizen. It's been nuclear for some years. It's never abused it. It has not taken on any other country in aggressive manner unless the other country aggressed against us or were aggressors against us in the first place. We are diverse, as you have mentioned, and we have the largest Muslim populations, sizable, any minorities in several million. With all that, we carry on without any great friction. There are fringes that try and make this happen, but both domestically and internationally, we seem to have made a success of our 70 years as a nation. And throughout the ages also...
Because Gautam Mukherjee, let's call a spade a spade. I'm just sorry, but I would follow up. The spade is this. Most, if not every other great power post 1947 was expecting and ideally hoping that India would collapse, that we would become chaotic Africa, right? Where we could be ruled by other means. If you have indirect rule, then you could have indirect rule. We would be so split apart that we would constantly be scurrying to some European power or the other, or the Americans or someone else for help to sort out our differences. We haven't had to, and what does that tell us about India? Before I still delve deeper into this question, which I also don't know, which is why I'm having this conversation, and a lot of people out there.
Look, in my opinion, there is an element of foreign intervention and influence, but we are not unique in that. However, I think we have been underestimated through the various regimes that this country has had. India has kept its head and followed its own, star. And we have not collapsed. You compare our elections to the American elections, at least in terms of the Election Commission, you have to say we did a very good job. And we continue. And remember, EVMs came during Congress times. And it goes on like that. What I feel that Diwali and this embrace of Diwali from all sorts of countries, and especially from their governments, that Indians would celebrate it wherever they are is one thing. But when governments start celebrating Diwali, or at least nodding towards it, it means they are nodding towards India as a force in global affairs. And this is going to increase as the time goes on, because not only are we able to be exceptionally good at reconciling differences and, as somebody used to say, managing contradictions. We are able to be hard and soft at the same time. And this is an unbeatable thing.
I'm just trying to figure out, 1,000 years ago, Sumit Peer, in a divided Europe, which was at war with each other, between France and the UK and the Germans and the Spaniards, Pope John Urban came up with an idea. And his idea was, let's pit religion versus religion. Let's unite the European Christian countries against the Muslim countries, the Muslim ruled areas, and began the Crusades. And of course, history tells us that Jerusalem, the same place where you have the Dome of the Rock from which the Prophet ascended to heaven, but also then down the road have Bethlehem, where of course Jesus was born, and the place of the sacrifice, and of course Christianity emerging contestedly from Judaism, for which Israel was the promised land. Within all of this, we have not seen these crusades and these jihads that have happened in India. We've seen pretexts of them, during a Mughal period, where the pretext was jihad, but in the end, the majority of India remained not Muslim at that point of time. You had Rajput warriors who at times were competing with, sometimes collaborating with the Mughals. I think barring one rebellion which was led by Himu, you still managed to have under a Muslim rule also a largely Hindu country.
Correct.
What was it about India that did not suck us into the clash of civilizations that the rest of the world saw?
I think, Rishabh, the power comes from Sanatana, because if something has survived for 20,000 years, it must have seen all the twists, turns, all the kinds of pressures. But if something is standing, your roots have to be rock solid. The belief in Sanatana, the belief in Hindu way of life, the belief in the deities and the manuscripts, that kept us going. For example, I'll give you an example, Rishabh. You see, there was a country called Pakistan which got independent with us. They wanted to be a Muslim Islamic country. What is their plight today? Where are they today? We know. We got independent, but we did not choose to be a Hindu country. We choose the way we are. And where are we today? Point number 2, Rishabh. Almost 90% or 99% of Muslims living in India are converted Hindus. But Hindus of the country never went for a renaissance or a crusade to reconvert them. They have taken the Islamic faith, well, it be good.
Okay, so Sumit, my point is that as a great way of life, okay, which affects 1 billion people, right? Which is not given, let's be honest, the same kind of mileage, because again, there were no Indian kings who went off to conquer faraway lands, right? India was a subcontinent in itself. What should people from other faiths be learning from the amalgamation from what is India? If you're trying to create a syncretic society in Europe, trying to figure out the problems with migration and identity, if you're trying to do the same in the UK, if you're trying to do the same in America, in which the first president of the country was a slave owner, what is the lesson that you should actually be drawing from India, both past and present?
I think the lesson which you should draw from India is that how, with so much of diversity, if your roots are strong, if the way of life you live is strong, and it is not a religion. If you propagate a way of life today, for example, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar or Ramdev ji or other saints, when they go across the world, they're not talking of Hinduism. Like yoga is not about Hinduism. Sanatan way of life is not about Hinduism. It is how you can be a better human being. Rather than concentrating on what is good in my religion, concentrate on how and what you can be a better human being. How can you coexist? If somebody has to learn from India. The minorities in Europe are 2-3%, the minorities in Europe are 3-4%. If you look at the numbers, they don't match up anywhere where we India are. But yet you thought we were snake charmers, you thought about rope tricks about us, but we are the 3rd biggest economy with the 4th biggest military. This is the lesson you should draw from India and stop looking down on India. Because time is ours, we have arrived.
Okay, let me just get Joyita, I have, I know you want to make a point, but I have a question also. And you make your point first, then I have a question.
Rishabh, when you see the most interesting thing about, if you look at Diwali or for that matter, Hinduism in general, is you see, Diwali, in spite of whatever we may be talking about as a cultural phenomenon, is intrinsically actually religious. But at the same time, you see, because at the heart of it, it's all about religion. It's about worshipping goddess Lakshmi, and there are certain rituals and all. It's intrinsically religious, but it has transcended. It has transcended religion to become a cultural phenomenon. And this has been possible, I would like to say, primarily because of the Indian way of life. And that is why this whole concept about, that they're trying to portray in the West in particular for certain reasons, and particularly to draw a balancing factor, I think they're trying to do. They're trying to portray Hindus and Hinduism as extremism. It comes from...
But this is happening, right? This is my point. Because this is
all about accommodation.
Joyita, this is happening as we speak, right? There is a global concerted effort, okay, which is trying to take a pretext or the other, okay, and the pretext right now is the Indian government, take that as the pretext, right, and is trying to portray a Hindu pride as some sort of Hindu chauvinism. Now, I am trying to figure out what is the distinction. How can you be a proud Hindu, right, and understand that the progeny of the crusades and the jihads and religious conflicts have not begun from India. We all read about the Ashokan pillars, which we can find from Burma all the way till Kabul, and they tell you of the epiphanies of the tragedies of war and loss and grief in the Dhamma being discussed by people like Ashoka 2000 years ago. So the distinction between Hindu pride and chauvinism, where is it?
Well, the thing is, when you're talking about chauvinism, the problem that has happened in this country is, even the very fact that if you went and said, wearing a red thread earlier, what used to happen, if you're wearing a red thread and you went to maybe quote unquote a secular establishment, or maybe you are in government, it was considered to be chauvinism. So the thing is, so what exactly? So, why do you think
red
this
thread.
whole reaction has come? Because the whole rise of the right is come from here. Because you have constantly told one section that, listen, whatever you believe in is bad, whatever you have done is bad, you should be ashamed of yourself. And the minute you start saying, sorry, there is no reason to be ashamed of it. That's why I'm saying, if I say that Diwali is actually about religion, but it transcends religion also, will I be called a chauvinist religious? But that is not the case. Diwali is about religion.
Okay, interesting thoughts over here. Let me get Gautam Mukherjee in, and I need to take a break. Then I want to come discuss the larger practical soft power impact of this across the globe. Gautam Mukherjee, Hindu pride versus Hindu chauvinism.
I think it's the usual communists. They're on the fringes. The good news is the centrality of it, the establishment in country after country, including Muslim countries, are looking up to India, are acknowledging that we are a worthwhile force in a very troubled world, and that we have a future contribution to make. So our festivals, religious they certainly are, but there is a lot of fun to it as well. There's Diwali with its crackers, there's lights, and Holi with its colors. We have lovely festivals. People want to adopt them. And they, at the same time...
No, but what do they represent? Do they represent a form of competitive chauvinism? Do they represent that or not? And that's the premise of the question, Gautam Mukherjee.
I think, first of all, any charge of chauvinism from leftist papers and websites and media...
No, I'm not interested in the left and right. I'm asking, forget all that.
It's bogus.
Yeah, I'm asking a straightforward question. Do you have to be apologetic now to be Hindu and be a proud Hindu and be accused of chauvinism?
I don't think it's possible to be Hindu and apologetic. I think that's absurd. Either you are a Hindu and quite happy to be a Hindu, but for somebody else to want to make you apologetic, that's their problem, not ours.
Okay, I need to take a break for a minute, and I want to come back and discuss geopolitical ramifications of this, because what we have almost forgotten, we had an interesting time when the Ram Mandir inaugural stone setting was happening, right? And I can tell you this, I have some leisure today on Diwali day. So we in a news channel, as a news channel editor, I have to make a judgment call, right? That this is what is happening. What is the perspective to be applied to that, if perspective is to be applied? And the conclusion we came to was, if you look at Makkah, if you look at Medina, one place where of course the Prophet was born and the other place where he went to live, if you look at the Vatican, and then if you look at Ayodhya, what does it actually represent? Does that represent Hindu Indianness, or does it actually represent something that transcends? I've been to the Vatican and seen the Sistine Chapel and found it very pretty, and the great St. Peter's Basilica, right? Does it imbibe something different? So we got, over the course of those 2 or 3 days, almost 40 people from 30 different countries, right? From Cambodia and Thailand and Indonesia, people from Hong Kong who mark the Ramayana, for whom this is a natural course of their day-to-day, year-to-year living. From South Africa to Mauritius to New York, everywhere where the Ramayana is performed, and it has its own inclinations, its own characters. The names are a bit different. In Thailand, I keep repeating, you land at the Swarnabhumi airport. That's the golden land. It's Sanskrit, but it's supposed to be a foreign country. And the lack of realization here of this perhaps begets a conversation. It must be taken to some sort of agreement and conclusion, even though the method in which it is being had certainly requires a change. And we are capable of having it with clarity and perspective. At a time when you're seeing the Indian festival, and I underline, the Indian festival, it's not a Moroccan festival, it's not an Australian festival, it's not a French festival, the Indian festival of Diwali being celebrated across the globe, from the UAE to Israel to New Zealand, Australia, Dubai, Taiwan, except of course in China. What is it that we now need to start understanding? The difference between Indic pride, which has a connotation with Hindu pride, and the attempt that is being made to translate that globally as a reflection of some sort of Hindu chauvinism, of extremism, of something to fear rather than something to hold in wonder of how is this possible? How can India function as the country it is? It should not work. The Chinese are trying desperately to homogenize their country because they think that looking here in India, diversity is a weakness. It's a fault line. Europe does not know diversity for all its claims of cosmopolitanness. America does not know diversity. It still can't even handle a racial divide. Its minority population, Hindus, Muslims, 6-7%, that's it. 6-7%. 90% is a homogeneous Christian population. It was these guys who went all over the world, in Africa, in South America, and did cultural, religious imperialism. These are now Christian majority countries, not because that's what they were made to be. So what does that teach us? I am now wanting to have the remaining 20 minutes of this conversation on Diwali Day on a strategic perspective. Sana Hashmi is still with us. Sana, at a time when we are being challenged in a very ideological way, because come 2021, in a few months from now, on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, get ready, we'll be told that socialism with Chinese characteristics and Xi Jinping thought is the better model for the world. We will be given an example of the chaos in the great democracies, the growth of China's economy, and be told that this is how the world should be run. The Taiwanese will disagree, the Tibetans will disagree, the Mongolians might disagree, the Uyghurs might disagree, some people in Hong Kong might disagree, but that's what we will be told, that the other system, including the Indian one, is inferior. So what now must we say, along with the Taiwanese and the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and the Mongolians, that no, there is a better system out there? Sana.
I think it will only be told by the Chinese. I don't think any other country agrees with the China model, be it governing or be it the response to the COVID. So even if you look at it, the situation right now, countries are trying to fight the China threat. They are trying to mitigate the threat which is coming from China. So we saw the revival of the quadrilateral dialogue. We are seeing the emergence of the Indo-Pacific construct. So I don't see it that way. So it's just the Chinese which are trying to sell their model. But we have to see who are the buyers. There's no one which is actually buying the Chinese argument. So I don't agree with that. But if you also look at Tsai Ing-wen wished Indians today, and she actually said that Taiwan is shining a light of democracy and freedom. And I believe that when it comes to India, diversity is one of our major strengths. And this is how we are discussing Diwali.
But Sana, what does it represent in our approach? Because we could have well argued, right? I mean, like the Chinese did, that we are going to take a map and we're going to draw a line. Okay, and we're going to call it the 11 dash line and the 9 dash line, and we'll say 10,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 500 years ago, some Chinese ship had sailed in these waters, so this is now our sea. Okay, when the truth is that that same area once upon a time was called the Sea of Champa, right? And you were in civilizations that drew their roots from India, from Indic civilizations that had. You go there in Vietnam and you can find shivlings which are being unearthed. Yet we don't claim this sea as an Indian sea. What does that teach us about our geostrategic logic and ethics?
This is Chinese way of consolidating their claims, and no one is actually accepting whatever they are talking about their claims. So Chinese, they never respect the status quo. So this is why there are countries which are trying to fight the China threat. So this narrative is actually being propagated by the Chinese. So you look at US, you look at, even if there is going to be new administration in the US, but the approach towards China is going to be more or less same. The intensity might differ, but China is going to be a threat to all the countries. So we really don't have to say whatever the Chinese are saying.
Okay,
and whatever
so in this geopolitical reality, what does India represent? Now you would be in touch with the perspective from Taiwan. What do they see India as? Do they see India as only as a counterbalance to China and that's it?
I don't think so. In fact, if you look at their statement also, they always say that India's ties with China is different from India-Taiwan relationship. The relationship with China and relationship with Taiwan should go parallel. So there's this argument that Taiwan should not be a card, should not be used as a card against China. It's very much there in the official policy of Taiwan as well. And I think if you look at India's response as well, you would also see that India is also not trying to do that. So there's merit in engaging Taiwan for India. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship.
So I'm trying to figure out what is in our past that merits us to have a civilizational conversation, Sumit Peer, that has been hacked by the Chinese in the modern context. They call it in the recent terms a century of humiliation, but in ancient terms this great cynic civilization, when the truth is there is no Harappa and Mohenjo-daro anywhere to be found in China. The Chinese country as it stands today never went past the Great Wall. That's why they built the Great Wall, because on the other side were the Mongols, and the great empires that came, Mongol, Mughal, that came out of that part of the world were by the descendants not of the Han Chinese but of Genghis Khan, who they disown. So what does that teach us about who is the civilizational ethos? Sumit Peer.
I think, Rishabh, give me a minute to explain this. The first thing is that when you run a way of life or a civilization which is 20,000 years and has survived, it is but natural other civilizations feel threatened, they feel timid, they feel, running for corners. So the best way is to find fault lines within that civilization. Can we create fault lines? Rishabh, 1,000 years back, we had crops here. 1,000 years back, there was no crops in China. They built a war because they were shit scared of Genghis Khan. Today, China is an amalgamation of captured lands which they have confiscated, which does not belong to them. So when the best way was to attack this civilization by weakening the roots, how do you weaken the roots? You cut the person from the religion. The moment you move the person from the religion, your way becomes very easy. How do you do it? You say my communism, my way of life is the best. Point number two, Rishabh. If you look at the number of Muslims even in India, add Europe, add USA, add Canada, and add Middle East together. More than that, Muslims live, thrive, prosper, and grow in India. We had a Muslim president of Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, whom I salute and endorse with. Now, even after these Muslims who are converted from Hindus to Islam, there is not a concerted effort, there is no effort at all to reconvert them. This is what scares China. This is what scares the world. And that is why they want to come to us. Chauvinism and Hinduism are also
Okay, so what does that translate into? Joyita Basu, what does it translate into us Indians? What should we be looking at out as? Because we have had, and let's accept it, right? The aspirational context, okay? That, I aspire and one day I will get my American passport, okay? And that will hold me in great value because I'll have a different quality of life. Oh, look, Rishi Sunak has become Chancellor of the Exchequer. Oh, look, Kamala Harris. Just because her name is Kamala, beyond that, she's represents a very dynamic culture, but she is not Indian. In this context, what should we as Indians now all over the globe, right, identify ourselves as? Who are we?
I don't think identity has ever been a problem for us, in spite of that urge to become American and Australian and Canadian and all. Identity has never been a problem for us, and because it has never been a problem for us, we have survived, in spite of the waves of invasion that have come into India. In spite of that, because you see what has happened, invasion has also led to assimilation. So accommodation and assimilation, these two things are very important in civilizational context. This has been very, very
No, but I want to know what does now a person who is now a global Indian, right? You're living in Singapore, you're living in Australia, you're working there, you are a trader, you work with Microsoft, you come back, you fly in, you fly out. What are you? Are you the brown person from a racist connotation? Are you the curry person? Are you the snake charmer? What do you now represent? What do we now represent as Indians?
I think we are modern, confident Indians, I think that's what, if we look at us ourselves, do we think in terms of curry and snake charmer and all that? No, we don't. We are talking to our, people who are internationally, people. We go abroad, we talk to people, we associate with them, and I think on an equal platform, and that is how I would like to believe that we are. We are proud Indians.
But we face the problem. No, it's so psychological, Joyita, which I'm trying to target the psyche. It is so psychological because of a product is made somewhere abroad. By very nature, we think it's better. I mentioned the other day we are having long conversation on the patta plates, right? On these leaf plates. Now that they're being made in Germany, suddenly they're a cool product. When we were using them all through our lifetimes, nobody cared about them. The same issue is with our apps, right? We think that the foreign products somehow are better. We don't even trust our own apps because, the data privacy of Facebook somehow is more trustworthy than our own government. These are very deep-rooted psychological issues. How do we now target them?
No, but Rishabh, is it okay? These may be deep-rooted psychological issues, but are they prevalent? Are they prevalent cutting across class and different, barriers that we look at, societal barriers? Is it prevalent? I don't think so, because there is also, if we can call it a revivalist movement, in terms of finding your own roots and taking pride in your own tradition. I think that is also going on, and it's pretty strong.
Okay, Gautam Mukherjee, both abroad, everybody wants to come in now. So both abroad, but less abroad, right? More here in India. Both in the aspirational context, which you can say has economic roots, but fair enough, the economy is changing and some of it will look after it. But it is that the Indian, if you say businessman, you look down on. But you just turn it to an entrepreneur, startup, suddenly it's a cool term, right? So if I say, dhande wala, yaar, dhande wala, we respect professionals and doctors and engineers in this country. Dhande walas are for some reason to be looked down on. But as soon as that person becomes an entrepreneur, he becomes cool. So these are problems here. I'm facing that, with app developers, with people coming up with products here. the respect, the auqat, the izzat that we give to ourselves needs to get into a different orbit. Why do we look at Google and Facebook? Why not look within?
Well, one is that you've got to be as good as them. You know, it's not enough to just make an app, it must work.
Fair enough, of course.
And Google and Facebook work. First things first. You've got to, if you want to equate, you have to be as good as, if not better. What has happened is, IT certainly did that. Our chaps may be coders or whatever, but they went there and then they became a force in Silicon Valley as well. They are known to be extremely smart, extremely quick, and extremely innovative. This has happened in academia all over the United States, which actually looks for bright people from all over the world and then gives them a decent living and scope to work. So all of this has been happening over a long time, over the last 7 decades. I think we have reached some kind of critical mass. The other thing is, culturally, this urge to assimilate and make one's own is very much
no, because I'm trying to boil it down to that when it comes to
intellectual level, look at Bhangra. Now everybody loves Bhangra because it's a very good beat. And then they mix it with, techno and so on. And
no, but I'm trying to boil it down to the context here within our country. Let's say Vivekananda, for example, is seeing controversy happening over a JNU statue. But in the Sun Tzus and the Machiavelli eras of the world, right? The respect that we give to within this country to a Kautilya. I face this problem of ending up in Italy and going to Pompeii and being asked, oh, you come from India, so wow. Look at the great temples you have over there, Ajanta, Ellora, to realize that I've not been to any of them, but I wanted to go to Pompeii. So something in my growing up aspired that was civilizational ethos as opposed to what was happening in my own backyard. Now, how much of this is just Ghar ki murgi dar barabar problem and how much of this is now psychological that we need to break? Gautam Mukherjee.
Rishabh, you started off by saying we are both products of Macaulay's children. Yes. Now, what were you taught? How much were you taught about Ajanta, Ellora, Sanatan, Dharma? This was rigorously kept out of it until lately, where we are once again with difficulty in the teeth of opposition from at least the communists, and going back to an earlier point about, Hindu chauvinism, I think what's happening is the counterpoint is essential in the for the dialogue where you've got so much Islamic terrorism. How can the Hindus not be terrorists in turn? So that's what that is about.
So they are assuming this. This is the assumption that you're saying people are drawing. Okay, I'm short of time, although this should be a very, very long conversation. But it's an interesting one, and the deeper we are going, the more interesting it's becoming. So Sumit Peer, I have a question and I know you have a point to make. And the question is this. If you go to a lot of schools and colleges, and like it or not, we still are taught Shakespeare and there are Shakespeare societies. I have never come across a Valmiki society in anywhere.
Right.
Okay. What does that tell us? What's the problem? Why?
I think, Rishabh, the perception that was built, if you have to keep an elephant in a box, make him feel that you're weak, you're good for nothing. That was the perception which the Britishers built over.
But they're gone, right? Though they left 80 years ago, they are gone now. So what is the string that they're still being able to pull?
There was an Islamic invasion for 600 years. Now, and after that, we had a kind of a communist government which was smeared as a secularist government. So communism was.
Yeah, I don't want to do it into stereotypes and black and white. I'm asking a simple question. Why, when we can have Shakespeare societies and be taught the British authors still, right? We don't have the Tagore societies and the Valmiki societies in the same number. Valmiki, I can't think of any. Tagore certainly not there in the same number. Why not? What is still missing?
Sir, I'll answer you, sir. The moment you have a Valmiki or a Tagore society, you will be kind of said it's a Hinduist society. But the moment you have a Farang name or a Shinzu or a Shakespeare, westernized or out non-Hindu is a secular society. So this secular communal divide, this Hindu and secular divide, which is artificial and political, has
I'm
to
out
be
of
broken.
time. I want to leave the last word.
It has to be broken.
Okay, last word with Sana. Yeah, Sana, take the larger point you wanted to make and just take the thought to my question and then we wind up. Sana.
I wanted to comment on your question about how Indians are being labeled as snake charmers and all. I think these are prejudices. I'm not denying that it doesn't exist anymore, But we have to see that Indians are holding key positions in international organizations and multinational corporations now. So world is reaching out to us. And if you look at this cross-country celebration of Diwali, I believe it's a demonstration of how India is rising and how India's influence is rising.
And perhaps even more deeply, a demonstration to us in India, which is why I'm having this conversation.
Correct.
This is not simply for a global audience. A global audience is reacting better
Without the
to
baggage, you
us
see.
than we often react to ourselves. They are seeing Diwali in less of a religious connotation than we do here. They are understanding Indian cultural civilization from Ayurveda to yoga a lot differently. But here, when we discuss Ayurveda, I know a ministry has been set up, right? We make jokes and we cock a snook. Yes, there might be some people who lose their plot on Gaumutra and whatever, but we cock a snook, right? Here, yoga has somehow become Modi's thing and therefore politically divisive. It's become rather strange. And this is why this conversation is so important in this country. I know it's a very, very theoretical one, and I'm going to come back and discuss geostrategy on the other side. But you're seeing on your screens, this is India rising. This is the definition. Without a threat to the world, not seen as a threat to the world, but just because we are no threat and are not seen as a threat doesn't mean there are not forces out there who want us to make us feel divided and inferior still. Now, we can choose not to. It's a choice. On the same premise that we were once told 80 years ago that 40,000 British cannot rule a country of 300 million people if those 300 million choose not to cooperate. So let us on this Diwali decide. We choose not to cooperate when we are told that Hindu pride is by default Hindu chauvinism. That if you are proud of celebrating Diwali, you are by definition a Hindu nationalist. If you talk about Valmiki or Ram, this is somehow Islamophobia. This is not the truth. It never was the truth until it was created. And the hunt for the truth, the Satyagraha, is where we started this conversation with.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.